Navy captain laughed at Single Dad's fishing boat, then saw the nuclear sub-commander certificate. He mocked the rusted boat like it was a joke, until the Single Dad pulled out a Navy document that made the whole harbor fall silent. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The morning sun cast long shadows across Chesapeake Bay Harbor as Jack Tanner's weathered boots clicked against the wooden dock. The salty air filled his lungs, a familiar comfort that marked the start of another working day. His old fishing boat, Grace, bobbed gently in the water, her white paint chipped but clean, much like everything else in Jack's carefully maintained world. "Daddy, I packed extra mustard this time." 8-year-old Ellie's voice rang out behind him as she carefully made her way down the dock, her small hands clutching a brown paper bag. Her dark hair was pulled back in 2 neat braids, the same way her mother used to wear. "That's my girl." Jack smiled, reaching down to help her aboard. "Remember what I taught you about 3 points of contact?" Ellie finished, demonstrating as she used both hands and 1 foot to steady herself while climbing onto the boat. "I remember everything you teach me, Daddy." Jack's chest tightened with pride, and something else, a familiar ache that never quite went away. At times like these, Ellie looked so much like her mother, it almost hurt to look at her. But he pushed the feeling down, focusing instead on their morning routine. As they worked together preparing for the day ahead, Jack's mind wandered to darker waters. The submarine control room flashed in his memory. Klaxons blaring, red warning lights flooding the compartment. His commanding officer's face twisted with rage as Jack countermanded his order. He could still hear the echo of his own voice. "With all due respect, sir, if we dive now, we'll lose the whole boat." The decision had saved 38 lives that day. It had also ended his naval career. Ellie's voice pulled him back to the present. "Can I tie the stern line today?" "Sure can, sunshine." Jack watched as she executed a perfect cleat hitch, her small fingers moving with surprising confidence. "That's Navy-worthy work right there. Miss Clara says I'm a natural sea woman," Ellie beamed, mentioning the harbor's beloved bait shop owner. As if on cue, the screen door of Clara's shop creaked open. "Speaking of the devil," Jack murmured with a warm smile as Clara Whitmore emerged, carrying a thermos. "You two aren't sneaking out without saying good morning, are you?" Clara called out, her silver hair catching the early light. She made her way down to them, careful steps betraying her 70-plus years. "Wouldn't dream of it, Miss Clara," Jack replied, accepting the thermos she thrust at him. "Though you don't need to bring us coffee every morning." "Hush now." Clara waved him off. "A man who works as hard as you deserves a decent cup of coffee. That instant stuff you drink is an insult to your taste buds." From further down the dock came a gravelly laugh. "Clara's right about that, Jack. Your coffee could strip paint off a battleship." Old Ben Carter approached, his Marine Corps cap pulled low over his eyes. He walked with a slight limp, a souvenir from Vietnam, though he never talked about it. The former Marine had been one of the first people to welcome Jack to the harbor community, never asking questions about his past when others whispered, "Morning, Ben." Jack nodded. "Fish biting yet?" "They're always biting for those who know where to look," Ben replied with a knowing wink at Ellie. "Though some folks might say the same about rumors." He knew what Ben meant. There had been more whispers lately about his past, especially since the naval base had changed commanders. People wondered why a former submarine officer would choose to scrape by as a small-time fisherman. Clara shot Ben a warning look before turning back to Jack. "Pay no mind to dock talk, Jack Tanner. You're a good man raising a fine daughter." "That's all anyone needs to know." Ellie, who had been checking their supplies, popped her head up from the cabin. "Daddy, we've got everything stored, just like on your checklist." "That's my first mate," Jack said, grateful for the distraction. "Ready to cast off?" As they prepared to leave, other fishermen began arriving at the harbor. Most nodded respectfully to Jack. They'd seen him work through storm seasons and slow catches, never complaining, never asking for help. A few, though, kept their distance, their sideways glances telling Jack all he needed to know about which rumors they believed. "You take care out there," Clara called, as Jack started the engine. "Weather report says it might kick up later." "We always do," Jack assured her, then turned to his daughter. "Ellie, want to help me with the bowline?" Together, they worked in comfortable sync, Ellie handling her tasks with a seriousness that sometimes made Jack's heart ache. She'd grown up too fast after her mother passed, determined to be strong for him. He wished she didn't feel she had to be. As Grace pulled away from the dock, Jack could hear old Ben's voice carrying across the water. "There goes the finest captain this harbor's got, whether he wears the stripes or not." The comment stirred something in Jack's chest, pride mixed with old shame. He'd made the right choice that day on the submarine. He knew that in his bones. But the cost had been steep. His career, his pension, his wife's faith in their future. She'd stood by him through the court-martial, but the stress had taken its toll. When the cancer came 2 years later, she'd had no strength left to fight it. The harbor grew smaller behind them as Grace cut through the morning chop. Ellie had settled into her usual spot near the bow, her face turned into the wind, fearless and free. Jack adjusted their heading, then glanced at the small framed photograph fixed beside the wheel. A woman with Ellie's dark hair and bright eyes, her smile full of life and love. "Another day, love," he murmured, touching the frame gently. "One more tide." The late morning sun blazed over Chesapeake Bay Harbor, transforming the usually quiet docks into a festive gathering. Red, white, and blue bunting draped across the weathered railings, and American flags snapped in the breeze. The annual Veterans Week boat fair had drawn a sizable crowd of locals and retired service members, their excited chatter mixing with the cry of seagulls and the gentle lapping of waves. Outside the harbor cafe, plastic chairs scraped against worn wooden planks as veterans shared stories over steaming cups of coffee. The aroma of fresh-baked muffins and fried fish drifted through the open door, mingling with the salty air. Captain Earl Denton held court at the largest table, his commanding voice carrying across the dock. His silver hair was perfectly combed, and his pressed khakis bore knife-edge creases, a stark contrast to the casual attire of those around him. A polished Navy captain's pin gleamed on his collar, catching the sunlight with each animated gesture. "Now that was real seamanship," Earl declared, punctuating his latest story with a firm tap on the table. "These days, they've got computers doing all the thinking. Back in my day, we navigated by the stars and our gut instincts." His audience, a mix of retired servicemen and curious locals, nodded appreciatively, even though most had heard similar tales before. Earl's attention wandered from his story as he surveyed the harbor, his sharp eyes taking in the vessels moored nearby. Most were freshly painted and gleaming for the fair, but one boat stood out like a sore thumb. The Grace sat low in the water, her white paint weathered and peeling in places. Though clean and obviously well-maintained, she was decidedly humble compared to the showcased vessels around her. A laugh burst from Earl's throat, loud and derisive. "Would you look at that floating tetanus shot?" He stood up, gesturing toward the Grace with his coffee cup. "That bathtub wouldn't pass a Coast Guard inspection if you paid them." Several people turned to look, and a small crowd began to gather. Some chuckled nervously, while others shifted uncomfortably, recognizing Jack Tanner's boat. Jack himself was on deck, methodically working to repair a fishing net. His weathered hands moved steadily through the familiar task, his expression remaining neutral despite Earl's booming voice carrying clearly across the water. He wore simple work clothes, faded jeans and a gray t-shirt that had seen better days, but there was a quiet dignity in the way he held himself. "Hey, buddy," Earl called out, encouraged by the attention. "You might want to upgrade from that piece of driftwood before it sinks." "Under you!" More awkward laughter rippled through the growing crowd. 8-year-old Ellie emerged from the Grace's small cabin, her dark hair in neat braids and her blue eyes concerned as she looked between her father and the laughing stranger on the dock. She wore her favorite overalls with a seahorse patch on the knee, the ones her father had mended 3 times because she refused to give them up. Jack paused in his work just long enough to place a gentle hand on Ellie's shoulder, giving her a reassuring squeeze before returning to the net. His silence seemed to fuel Earl's performance. "I bet that thing's held together with bubblegum and prayers," Earl continued, playing to his audience. "Probably can't even make it past the harbor mouth without, would you laugh if it was a submarine?" Ellie's clear voice cut through the chatter, silencing the crowd. She stood at the Grace's rail now, her small hands gripping the wood, chin raised as she faced Earl directly. Hung in the air like thunder before a storm, Earl's smile faltered as he processed the child's words. Several onlookers exchanged knowing glances. They knew Jack's history, even if they rarely spoke of it. Earl opened his mouth to respond, but something caught his eye. Through the Grace's cabin door, which Ellie had left open, a metal plaque was visible on the inner wall. Though tarnished with age, its engraving was clear enough to read: Cumder, Jack Tanner, U.S. Navy, USS Roosevelt. The coffee cup in Earl's hand lowered slowly. His face, red from laughter moments before, drained of color as recognition dawned in his eyes. The proud captain stood frozen on the dock, his mouth slightly open, but no words coming out. Without a word or glance toward the shocked crowd, Jack coiled his repaired net and stored it carefully. His movements were unhurried and precise as he untied the Grace's mooring lines. The boat's engine chugged to life with a steady purr that spoke of meticulous maintenance despite its aged appearance. As the Grace pulled away from the dock, the only sounds were the gentle slap of waves against her hull and the distant cry of seagulls. Jack stood at the wheel, his posture straight but relaxed, while Ellie waved goodbye to some of the regular dock workers who had gathered to watch. The morning crowd remained unusually quiet as the small fishing boat made its way toward the harbor entrance, leaving ripples in the water and unspoken questions in its wake. Earl Denton sat alone at a corner table in the harbor cafe, his coffee growing cold and untouched. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the cafe's salt-streaked windows, but the warmth couldn't chase away the chill of embarrassment that had settled in his chest. His earlier mockery of Jack's boat now felt like lead in his stomach. Around him, the cafe buzzed with conversation. Most patrons had moved inside to escape the afternoon heat, and their whispered words drifted across the room like a persistent tide. "That's right, nuclear submarine commander, if you can believe it," a woman's voice carried from nearby. "My Henry worked at the base when it happened." "What happened?" another voice asked. "Nobody really knows. It was all hushed up." Earl's ears perked up despite himself. He gripped his coffee mug tighter, trying to appear disinterested while straining to hear more. Old Ben Carter chose that moment to slide into the chair across from Earl, his weathered face creased with knowing disapproval. "Quite a show you put on this morning, Captain." Earl shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I didn't know who he was." "Most folks don't," Ben replied, his voice gruff but measured. "And Jack prefers it that way. What's the real story?" "Ben, you've been around here longer than most." Ben leaned back, his chair creaking under his weight. His eyes, sharp despite his age, studied Earl's face. "Court-martial, about 6 years back. Jack was commanding the Roosevelt, one of our finest nuclear subs. Something went wrong during a classified mission. Details never came out, but word is he disobeyed a direct order." Earl's eyebrows shot up. In the Navy, disobeying orders was the cardinal sin. Must have been serious. "Serious enough to end his career," Ben confirmed. "But here's the thing that always struck me funny. They didn't strip his pension completely. Usually, they throw the book at officers who disobey orders, especially on nuclear vessels. But Jack got to keep some benefits. Makes you wonder what really went down." Earl stared into his coffee, remembering the quiet dignity with which Jack had absorbed his mockery that morning. The man hadn't shown an ounce of the arrogance Earl had encountered in most submarine commanders. "I need to apologize," Earl said finally, standing up. Ben nodded approval. "He'll be at the market now, unloading today's catch." Earl found Jack at the back of Peterson's fish market, methodically transferring ice-packed fish from his coolers to the store's storage. His movements were efficient, practiced the motions of a man who had learned to find peace in simple work. "Commander Tanner," Earl called out softly. Jack straightened up slowly, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Just Jack is fine, Captain." Earl cleared his throat, suddenly feeling every bit his age. "About this morning I was out of line. I didn't know." Jack cut him off, but his voice held no anger. "Boats and men both rust, Captain. No shame in it." The simple grace of the response made Earl's shame deepen. Before he could respond, rapid footsteps approached from behind. "Daddy!" Ellie came bounding around the corner, her school backpack bouncing. "Miss Peterson said I could help sort the fish." She skidded to a stop when she saw Earl, her smile fading slightly. Jack's entire demeanor softened as he looked at his daughter. "Did you finish your homework first?" "Most of it," Ellie admitted. "Just have reading left." "Then that comes first," Jack said firmly but kindly. "Help me load these last few boxes, then we'll head home." Earl watched as father and daughter worked together, their movements synchronized by long practice. Ellie chatted about her day at school while Jack listened intently, asking questions that showed he remembered every detail of her previous stories. There was something profound in their simple interaction, a love that needed no grand gestures or declarations. As they finished loading the last box, Jack turned to Earl. "We need to get home. Reading time is sacred in our house." Earl nodded, words failing him as he watched Jack and Ellie climb into their old pickup truck. The vehicle's paint was faded, much like Grace's, but it started without hesitation. As they pulled away, Earl found himself whispering, "There's more to that man than he lets on." The harbor sun was setting behind Grace, painting the sky in deep crimson. The old fishing boat's silhouette stood dark against the red light, its humble outline somehow more dignified now in Earl's eyes. Morning sunlight sparkled on the harbor waters as Jack Tanner worked methodically on his fishing nets. His weathered hands moved with practiced precision, weaving through the torn sections with new cord. The salty breeze carried the calls of seagulls and the distant clanking of boat rigging. The sound of footsteps on the wooden dock made Jack look up. Earl Denton approached cautiously, balancing 2 steaming coffee mugs. His usual confident stride was replaced by something more hesitant, almost sheepish. "Thought you might need this," Earl said, extending one of the mugs. "It's from Clara's shop. Better than that instant stuff." Jack paused his work, studying Earl's face for a moment, before accepting the coffee with a quiet thanks. The rich aroma of fresh coffee drifted between them as an awkward silence settled in. Earl cleared his throat, gesturing toward Grace's exposed motor. "Couldn't help but notice yesterday that Johnson outboard's running a bit rough. I know a thing or two about engines, if you'd like a hand." Jack took a slow sip of coffee, considering the offer. His pride warred briefly with practicality. The motor did need work, and parts weren't cheap. "Wouldn't mind an extra set of hands," he finally said. Earl's face brightened. He shrugged off his jacket and rolled up his sleeves. "Let me grab my tools from the car." Soon they were working side by side, the morning quiet broken only by the occasional request for a wrench or screwdriver. As they cleaned the carburetor, Earl shared stories about his first command, a patrol boat in the South China Sea. "Engine gave out right in the middle of a storm," he recalled, hands deep in Grace's motor. "Youngest mechanic we had was seasick as a dog, but he got us running again. Sometimes I think the Navy's held together by kids too green to know what can't be done." Jack nodded, a ghost of a smile crossing his face. "Had a chief like that on the Roosevelt. Could fix anything with duct tape and determination." They worked through the morning, trading stories that carefully skirted anything too personal or painful. Earl noticed how Jack's voice would sometimes catch when mentioning his submarine days, but he didn't push. Some wounds needed time to heal. Around 3 o'clock, the clip-clop of running feet announced Ellie's arrival from school. Her backpack bounced as she raced down the dock, face lighting up at the sight of the 2 men working on her father's boat. "Dad! Captain Denton!" she called out, skidding to a stop. "What are you doing?" Earl wiped his hands on a rag and gave her a theatrical bow. "Well, if it isn't the Admiral of Ice Cream herself, we're just giving your fine vessel some much-needed attention." Ellie giggled at the title. "Admiral of Ice Cream? Oh, yes," Earl said seriously. "A very important position, in charge of all frozen treats in the 7 seas. Learn some proper nautical knots while we work?" "Can I, Dad?" Ellie asked, bouncing on her toes. Jack nodded, his eyes soft as he watched Earl show his daughter how to tie a bowline. The older man's gruff voice grew gentle as he guided Ellie's small hands through the motions. "Loop it like this. See? We call this the rabbit coming out of his hole," Earl explained, helping her practice. "Now you try." The afternoon passed in a blur of engine work and knot tying lessons. Earl taught Ellie sea shanties that made her laugh, while Jack found himself sharing more freely about his early Navy days. The tension that had existed between the 2 men slowly dissolved in the warm afternoon sun and Ellie's infectious enthusiasm. As the sky began to turn golden, they finally closed up Grace's motor panel. The engine purred smoothly when Jack tested it, running better than it had in months. "That should do it," Earl said, gathering his tools. His clothes were stained with grease, but his face held, a contentment that hadn't been there that morning. "Didn't expect company today," Jack said quietly, extending his hand. Earl clasped it firmly, meeting Jack's eyes. "Neither did I, son." The words carried a warmth that went beyond the fading sunlight. The moment held, then passed. Naturally, as Ellie showed off her newly mastered knots, the harbor breeze carried the smell of salt and possibility, and something that felt surprisingly like friendship began to take root on the old wooden dock. The Grace cut smoothly through the morning waters of Chesapeake Bay, her newly repaired motor humming with renewed vigor. The late summer breeze filled the small boat's sails, carrying with it the tang of salt and freedom. Jack stood at the helm, his weathered hands resting easily on the wheel, while Earl and Ellie sat nearby on deck chairs, unpacking their picnic lunch. "This old girl's running like a dream now," Earl commented, patting the boat's railing appreciatively. "Amazing what a little TLC can do." Ellie carefully laid out paper plates on a small folding table, her pigtails bouncing as she worked. "Did you really fix the whole engine, Captain Earl?" "Your dad did most of the work, sweetheart," Earl replied, watching as Jack guided them through a gentle turn. "I just handed him the tools and shared some sea stories." Jack smiled slightly, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The morning sun caught the silver in his hair, making him look older than his years. "Don't sell yourself short, Earl. That carburetor trick of yours saved me a bundle." They settled into an easy lunch of sandwiches and lemonade, the gentle rocking of the boat providing a soothing backdrop to their meal. Seagulls wheeled overhead, hopeful for a stray crumb. Ellie tossed them bits of bread, giggling as they caught them mid-flight. Earl watched Jack's practiced movements at the helm, noting how naturally he handled the boat. It was more than just fishing experience. There was military precision in every adjustment, every check of the instruments. "You know," Earl began carefully, setting down his sandwich, "I've been wondering, why'd you leave the Navy, Jack? Man, with your experience, could have gone far." The question hung in the air like storm clouds. Jack's shoulders tensed almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained steady. "Sometimes truth sinks deeper than the sea, Earl." Ellie looked up from her sandwich, her young face showing concern at the sudden change in her father's tone. Jack forced a smile and quickly changed the subject, pointing out a pod of dolphins breaking the surface nearby. The afternoon passed pleasantly enough, though Earl noticed how Jack skillfully deflected any further questions about his service. As they approached the harbor in the golden light of evening, the dock was busier than usual. Several vessels had arrived for the upcoming boat fair, including a sleek Navy patrol craft. Jack expertly guided Grace into her slip, with Earl handling the bowline and Ellie standing ready with the stern rope. As they secured the boat, a tall officer in summer whites approached the dock. The man stopped abruptly, recognition flashing across his face as he spotted Jack. The officer's posture stiffened, and he raised his hand in a crisp salute. "Commander Tanner." His voice carried clearly across the wooden planks. Jack returned the salute automatically, his face carefully neutral. "Lieutenant Commander Briggs. You're a full commander now, I see." "Yes, sir." Briggs' tone was cold as he lowered his hand. "Didn't think I'd see you after what happened, Commander." The atmosphere on the dock turned as thick as fog. Ellie pressed closer to her father's side, sensing the tension. Jack placed a protective hand on her shoulder. "Life has a way of surprising us all, Briggs," Jack replied quietly. "Have a good evening." The officer moved on, but his presence had cast a shadow over the day's peace. Earl watched the exchange with growing curiosity, noting how the other Navy personnel on the dock had fallen silent, their eyes following Jack as he helped Ellie gather their things from the boat. Later that evening, after Jack and Ellie had headed home, Earl found old Ben Carter at his usual spot by the bait shop. The old Marine was organizing tackle boxes, his gnarled hands moving with surprising dexterity. "Ben," Earl said, settling onto a nearby crate, "what really happened with Jack Tanner?" Ben glanced around before answering, his voice low. "It was classified, most of it. But word gets around in Navy towns." He paused, checking again that they were alone. "There was an incident few years back. On a submarine. The Roosevelt. Something about disobeying direct orders." "Disobeying orders?" Earl leaned forward. "Jack doesn't strike me as the type. Sometimes the right thing and the ordered thing ain't the same." Ben replied cryptically. "That's all I know for certain. Whatever happened, it cost him his career. Across town, Jack was tucking Ellie into bed in their modest house. Her room was decorated with a mixture of princess items and toy boats, a blend of fairy tales and maritime heritage. "Daddy?" Ellie asked sleepily as he pulled up her covers. "Do you miss the big boats?" Jack sat on the edge of her bed, his expression softening in the warm glow of her nightlight. He glanced at the framed Navy commendation on his nightstand, a reminder of another life, another time. "Not the boats, honey," he said quietly, brushing her hair back from her forehead. "The men." He stared at the commendation for a long moment before turning off the light, leaving only the soft glow of Ellie's star-shaped nightlight to illuminate the room. The morning sun painted long shadows across the weathered planks of the harbor as Earl's determined footsteps echoed along the dock. Jack was already aboard Grace, his practiced hands working through his daily maintenance routine. The excitement in Earl's stride made Jack pause, a slight frown crossing his features. Jack, I've got something," Earl called out, waving a small notebook in his hand. "Remember Commander Phillips from the Roosevelt? Well, I tracked him down through some old contacts. He's willing to—" "Stop right there." Jack's voice carried a sharp edge that made Earl halt mid-stride. "Whatever you're doing, whatever you think you're helping with, don't." Earl's enthusiasm deflated slightly, but his jaw set with stubborn determination. "Son, I've been asking around. Something's not right about what happened to you, and people know it. We. Jack stepped onto the dock, his shoulders tense. "There is no we in this, Captain. That chapter of my life is closed. Let it stay buried." "Like you've stayed buried?" Earl's voice softened with concern. "Living on this small boat, scraping by on fishing runs when you should be." "Should be what?" Jack's eyes flashed. "Commanding a submarine? Living some different life?" He ran a hand through his graying hair. fighting to keep his composure. "You don't know what happened." "Then tell me," Earl pressed, stepping closer. "Because what I do know doesn't add up. A decorated commander doesn't just throw away his career without reason." The harbor around them buzzed with morning activity. But between the two men, time seemed to stand still. Jack stared at the water for a long moment, his jaw working silently. "It was a nuclear test mission," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Routine stuff. Or it should have been. We were running drills off the coast of—" He stopped, shaking his head. "Doesn't matter where. What matters is what we found." Earl remained silent, watching as Jack struggled with memories he'd clearly locked away for years. There was a malfunction in one of the cooling systems. Nothing major at first, but the protocols were clear surface immediately, full stop, emergency procedures. Jack's eyes grew distant. But my superior had other ideas. We had dignitaries aboard, some big brass watching the tests. He ordered me to continue the drill. "And you refused," Earl said softly. Jack nodded slowly. "I did more than refuse. I took control of the boat, ordered an emergency shutdown against direct orders from a superior officer." His hands gripped the dock railing. "2 crew members died during the evacuation procedures. If we'd continued the drill—" He trailed off, leaving the unspoken horror hanging in the air. "You saved the rest of the crew," Earl stated firmly. "Maybe. But in the Navy, disobedience costs careers. Someone had to take the fall, and Jack's voice caught. "I had my reasons for accepting it." "You protected someone," Earl realized aloud. Jack's silence was answer enough. Their conversation was interrupted by the harbor master, approaching with a clipboard and a grim expression. "Mr. Tanner, we need to discuss your docking fees. You're 3 months behind, and I'm afraid I'll have it by the end of the week." Jack cut in quickly, but the harbor master shook his head. "I'm sorry, but we've been too lenient already. Without payment by tomorrow, we'll have to suspend your commercial fishing license." After the harbor master left, Earl watched Jack stare at Grace, his whole world seemingly balanced on a knife's edge. The morning sun had climbed higher, but shadows still seemed to cling to Jack's features. "Let me help," Earl offered quietly. "You can't fix this," Jack replied, his voice tired. "Any of it." The day passed in a blur of worried calculations and failed attempts to secure a loan. As dusk settled over the harbor, Jack stood alone on the pier, watching the golden light fade from Grace's worn hull. The soft sound of approaching footsteps announced Earl's return. "You fought one war already," Earl said, coming to stand beside him. "Maybe it's time to fight another, the one for yourself." Jack remained silent, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the sun was sinking into the sea. The waves lapped softly against the pilings below, a rhythmic sound that had long ago become the heartbeat of his world. Now it seemed to echo with questions he'd spent years avoiding. Night crept across the harbor, bringing with it the first stars of evening. The day's warmth faded into a cool breeze that carried the promise of change, whether welcomed or not. The morning fog still clung to the harbor when Earl's pickup truck rumbled into the parking lot. His truck bed was loaded with supplies, buckets of fresh paint, coils of new rope, and various tools. Jack looked up from where he stood on Grace's deck, coffee mug in hand, surprise evident on his weathered face. "What's all this?" Jack called out, watching Earl struggle with an oversized bucket of white paint. "Can't have you entering the Chesapeake Regatta looking like this," Earl replied, gesturing at Grace's peeling paint and worn surfaces. "She needs some love, and I've got time to spare." Jack set his mug down and crossed his arms. "Who said anything about entering the regatta?" "I did, just now." Earl's eyes twinkled with determination as he started unloading supplies onto the dock. "Come on, son. Give me a hand with these brushes." The morning air was cool and crisp as they began their work. Earl had brought everything they needed: sanders, primers, fresh paint, new ropes, and even some brass polish for Grace's few remaining metal fixtures. They started by scraping off the old paint, their movements falling into an easy rhythm. Other dock workers began arriving for the day, casting curious glances their way. Miss Clara appeared mid-morning with a box of fresh donuts and 2 thermoses of coffee. "Thought you boys might need some fuel," she said, setting everything down on a nearby bench. Her eyes swept over their work. "You know what? I've got some leftover marine paint from when we redid the shop last spring. Let me bring that over." Before long, word spread through the small harbor. Community. A group of local kids showed up with their parents' tools, eager to help. Even some of the skeptical fishermen who usually kept their distance wandered over to lend a hand. As they worked, the conversation flowed naturally. Earl noticed how Jack seemed more relaxed with each passing hour, as if the physical labor of restoration was helping him shed some of his usual reserve. "Ellie's mother would have loved this," Jack said quietly as they painted the starboard side. His brushstroke slowed. "Sarah always said Grace needed a makeover." Earl paused, sensing the weight in Jack's words. "Tell me about her," he said gently. Jack dipped his brush in the paint, taking his time before speaking. "She was the strongest person I knew. When everything went wrong with the Navy, she never lost faith in me. Not once." He swallowed hard. "She got sick while I was going through the court-martial. I couldn't even be there properly for her last months because of all the hearings." The pain in Jack's voice made Earl's chest tighten. "The submarine incident," he said carefully. "You mentioned it. Cost lives." Jack nodded, his eyes fixed on his work. "We were running tests on new nuclear protocols. My superior officer made a call I knew was wrong. Could have led to catastrophic failure. I countermanded his order." He wiped his forehead with his sleeve. "Saved the boat and crew, but 3 men were injured in the emergency shutdown. My career was over, but at least no one died." "You did the right thing," Earl said firmly. "Maybe, but Sarah paid the price too. Our savings went to lawyers. Had to sell our house. She never complained, just kept saying we'd rebuild." Jack's brushstrokes became more deliberate. "She passed away believing I'd clear my name someday." They worked in respectful silence after that, the sound of sanders and brushes filling the air. By late afternoon, Grace was transformed. Fresh white paint gleamed in the sun. New ropes coiled neatly on deck, and her brass fittings shone like new coins. Ellie arrived from school and gasped at the sight. "Dad, she looks beautiful." She ran her hand along the freshly painted hull, like a real racing boat. "That she does," Earl agreed, grinning at her enthusiasm. Miss Clara appeared again, this time with a picnic basket. "Thought you might all enjoy dinner on the pier," she said, spreading a checkered tablecloth on a nearby table. "It's too nice an evening to waste indoors." The setting sun painted the harbor in soft golden light as they sat down to eat. Miss Clara had prepared fried chicken, potato salad, and her famous apple pie. The conversation flowed easily, punctuated by Ellie's excited chatter about the upcoming regatta. Jack looked at his boat, then at his daughter's shining face, and finally at Earl, who had become such an unexpected friend. A genuine smile spread across his features, the first real one Earl had seen since they'd met. Maybe this old boat's still got one good. "Voyage left," Jack said, his voice warm with hope. Earl met his gaze steadily. "Met is, so do you." Around them, the harbor settled into evening, Grace's fresh paint glowing in the last light of day, a symbol of renewal and possibility. The morning sun cast long shadows across Earl's kitchen table as he stared at the thick manila envelope that had just arrived. His hands trembled slightly as he read the return address: Office of Naval Records, Washington, D.C. After weeks of calling in favors and pestering old contacts, something had finally come through. Earl poured himself a cup of coffee. settled into his chair, and carefully opened the envelope. Documents spilled onto the worn tablecloth. Official transcripts, handwritten letters, and photographs from the USS Roosevelt's final mission under Jack's command. The paper had that distinct government feel, crisp and formal, with stamps marking some pages as declassified. His reading glasses perched on his nose, Earl began sorting through the materials. The first document was a transcript from the court-martial hearing. As he read, his coffee grew cold and forgotten. His eyes widened at the testimony of Lieutenant James Morrison, the reactor officer. Commander Tanner's actions, while in direct violation of orders, prevented a Level 1 nuclear incident. The cooling system malfunction would have led to. Earl shuffled through more papers, finding letters from crew members written after the incident. One from Chief Petty Officer Thomas Williams stood out. Commander Tanner knew what those orders meant. He chose to save his crew instead of following protocol. They called it insubordination, but we called it courage. The morning stretched into afternoon as Earl pieced together the truth. Jack hadn't just disobeyed orders. He'd prevented a disaster that could have killed everyone aboard and contaminated miles of coastline. The superior officer who'd given the original order had later resigned under mysterious circumstances. Earl's hands clenched into fists. All these years, Jack had carried this burden alone. Later that afternoon, Earl walked down to the harbor market to grab some supplies. As he passed the bait shop, he overheard two fishermen talking in low voices. Heard the old captain's been asking questions about Tanner's Navy days. One said, leaning against a stack of crab pots, "Stirring up trouble if you ask me. Some things are better left buried," the other replied. "Man's got a kid to think about." Earl's jaw tightened, but he kept walking. Let them talk. They didn't know what he knew now. The sun was setting when Earl pulled up to Jack's modest house near the water. It was a small place, white paint peeling in places. But the yard was neat, and children's toys were carefully arranged on the porch. Through the window, he could see Jack and Ellie at the kitchen table, probably working on her homework. Earl grabbed the envelope from his passenger seat and walked to the door. His knock was answered by Jack's surprised face. "Earl? Everything all right? Need to talk to you, Jack. It's important." Earl's voice was graver than usual. Jack studied him for a moment, then nodded and led him into the kitchen. Ellie looked up from her math homework and beamed. "Grandpa Earl." The nickname made Earl's heart warm, even as the weight of the envelope seemed to grow heavier in his hands. Jack must have sensed something was off, because he turned to his daughter. "Ellie, why don't you finish that upstairs?" "But I'm almost done," she protested. "Please, sweetheart." Jack's voice was gentle but firm. Once Ellie had gathered her books and headed upstairs, Jack gestured for Earl to sit at the kitchen table. The evening light filtered through the window, casting long shadows across the worn surface. "What's this about?" Jack asked, though his expression suggested he already knew. Earl placed the envelope on the table between them. "Got some interesting reading today. Roosevelt. About what really happened." Jack's face hardened. "I told you to leave it alone." "You were right." Earl pressed on, pulling out the documents. "The crew's testimonies, the technical reports, they all show you made the right call. That order you disobeyed, it would have killed everyone aboard." "It doesn't matter anymore." Jack's voice was tight. "Doesn't matter? Jack, you saved those men's lives. You prevented a nuclear disaster, and they hung you out to dry for it." Earl spread the papers across the table. "Look at these letters from your crew. They never believed you deserved what happened." Jack stared at the documents, but didn't touch them. His hands were clenched in his lap. "I buried this a long time ago, Earl. I made my peace with it." "Peace?" Earl's voice rose slightly. "Is that what you call this? Living in shame for doing the right thing? Your daughter deserves to know her father's a hero, not don't." Jack's word cut through the air like a knife. "Don't. Bring Ellie into this. As if summoned by her name, they heard footsteps on the stairs. Ellie appeared in the doorway, her eyes moving between the two men and the papers scattered across the table. "Daddy," she said softly. "Grandpa Earl says the truth doesn't rust." The simple wisdom of her words hung in the air. Jack looked at his daughter, and something shifted in his expression. Pain, pride, and love warred across his features. "Sometimes it sinks," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. The kitchen fell silent, except for the distant sound of waves through the open window, eternal as truth itself. The harbor sparkled like scattered diamonds in the early morning light as crowds gathered along the weathered docks. Grace, freshly painted in crisp white and navy blue, bobbed gently at her mooring. The old fishing boat had been transformed through weeks of dedicated work. Her brass fittings gleamed, new ropes coiled neatly on deck, and even her worn timbers seemed to stand prouder. Jack stood at the helm, his calloused hands resting lightly on the wheel. He wore his old Navy cap, faded but clean, and a simple white shirt that Ellie had insisted on ironing the night before. The morning breeze carried the familiar scents of salt water and tar, mingling with the excitement buzzing through the growing crowd. "Ready to show them what a real boat can do?" Earl called out as he climbed aboard, wearing his full-dress uniform despite the casual nature of the event. His brass buttons and medals caught the sun. "Ready as we'll ever be," Jack replied quietly, helping Ellie aboard. She wore a blue sailor dress and had tied her hair back with a ribbon that matched Grace's new paint. The other contestants were already heading out to the starting line, sleek, modern vessels with gleaming hulls and state-of-the-art equipment. Their crews cast dubious glances at Grace as they passed, but Jack kept his eyes forward, focused on the course ahead. "Remember what I donned. Taught you about the winds here, Ellie?" Earl asked as they prepared to cast off. "Yes, sir," she beamed. They shift west after noon because of the warm air rising from the land. "That's my girl," Jack smiled, pride warming his voice. "Why don't you take the forward watch position?" The starting horn blared across the water. Grace's old engine chugged to life, and they pulled away from the dock to cheers and waves from the townspeople. Miss Clara's voice carried clearly over the others. "Show 'em what you've got, Jack Tanner." The racecourse wound through the bay's channels, around marker buoys, and back to the harbor. As they approached the starting line, Jack felt a familiar calm settle over him, the same feeling he'd known on submarine duty, when experience and instinct merged into pure focus. The second horn sounded. They were off. The faster boats quickly pulled ahead, their wakes chopping the water. But Jack knew Grace's strengths. He guided her steadily through the first turn, taking a tighter line than the others dared, with their deeper keels, winds picking up from the southeast. Earl called out, adjusting the mainsail with practiced ease. "Just like the old days. Eh, Commander?" Jack nodded, allowing himself a small smile. The familiar rhythm of working together had returned naturally, Earl handling the sails while Jack steered, Ellie calling out distances to the markers and checking their heading. They passed the halfway point, still trailing the leaders, but Jack remained focused. He'd studied the weather patterns, the tides, the shallow spots that locals knew to avoid. When the wind shifted exactly as Ellie had predicted, they were ready. While the other boats tacked widely to catch the new wind direction, Grace cut inside, riding the current Jack knew ran close to shore. They gained steadily, passing one boat, then another. "That's it, Dad!" Ellie shouted as they moved into third place. The crowd on shore had grown larger, their cheers carrying across the water. The final leg stretched before them, a straight shot back to the harbor. The two lead boats were still ahead, but fighting each other's wake, their crews shouting and jostling for position. "Now, Earl," Jack called. The old captain unfurled their secret weapon, a spinnaker sail they'd restored from Jack's racing days. The bright fabric filled with wind, and Grace surged forward like a horse given free rein. They drew even with the leaders as the finish line approached. Jack felt the wheel alive in his hands, responding to each subtle adjustment. This wasn't about winning anymore. It was about proving that some things ran deeper than shame or rust or time. Grace pulled ahead in the final 100 yards, her bow cutting cleanly through the waves as decades of experience guided her home. They crossed the finish line to thunderous cheers from the crowd, Ellie jumping up and down while Earl let out a whoop that belonged to a much younger man. As they tied up at play, the dock, it seemed the whole town had gathered to congratulate them. Miss Clara pushed through with hugs for all three. Old Ben stood straighter than usual as he shook Jack's hand. Even the crews from the other boats came by to offer genuine congratulations. The afternoon flowed into evening, and bonfires were lit along the shore. Tables appeared laden with food, and someone started playing guitar. Under the deepening sky, Earl stood and called for attention. "Folks," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the crowd. "I've known many sailors in my day, seen plenty of heroes wearing medals in bars. But true courage isn't just about one moment of glory. He turned about sailing through the storms life sends your way, day after day, with your head held high and your heart steady." He turned to Jack. "Some men face their battles at sea, others in the harbor of their own hometown. But real heroes are the ones who keep their course true, through shame and storms alike." A hush fell over the Prend gathering. Jack felt Ellie's small hand slip into his. As Earl continued, today wasn't just about winning a race. It was about a community coming together, about faith restored, and about second chances that are earned through grit and grace. The crowd burst into applause. Someone pressed a glass into Jack's hand, and he found himself being urged to speak. Looking around at the familiar faces, some who had doubted, others who had helped, all who were here now, he raised his glass. "To second chances," he said simply. "To second chances." The crowd echoed as fireworks burst overhead, painting the harbor in cascading colors of gold and silver, reflecting off Grace's newly painted hull and the shining faces of friends old and new. The morning sun had barely risen when Jack heard the first car doors slam outside his modest waterfront home. He pushed aside the thin curtain, and his heart sank. At least 5 news vans lined his usually quiet street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal fingers. Behind them stood 3 official-looking Navy vehicles, their dark windows reflecting the orange morning light. "Daddy?" Ellie appeared in her pajamas, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Why are there so many people outside?" Jack's throat tightened. "Just some folks who want to talk, sweetheart. Why don't you go get dressed? We might need to stay at Aunt Clara's today." As Ellie padded back to her room, Jack's phone buzzed. Earl's name flashed on the screen. He ignored it, his jaw clenching as camera flashes started popping through his front windows. A firm knock echoed through the house. Jack opened the door to find Captain Marcus Reynolds, Naval Internal Affairs, flanked by 2 junior officers. Behind them, reporters jostled for position, microphones thrust forward like weapons. "Commander Tanner," Reynolds said, his voice carrying across the lawn, "the Navy has formally reopened the inquiry into the USS Roosevelt incident. We need to discuss your involvement." The words hit Jack like a physical blow. He'd buried that pain years ago, sealed it away where it couldn't hurt Ellie. Now, it was all spilling out into the morning light. "Commander Tanner," a reporter shouted. "Is it true you endangered your entire crew? Did you deliberately disobey direct orders? What really happened on the Roosevelt?" Jack's hands trembled as he closed the door on the chaos. He called Clara, who promised to pick up Ellie through the back door. Then he dialed Earl. "Jack, I just heard Earl started." "Save it." Jack cut him off, his voice low and dangerous. "You did this. All your digging, all your calls to old contacts. Did you think they wouldn't notice? I was trying to help to clear your name. You had no right." Jack's shout echoed off the kitchen walls. "No right to drag this back up. I have a daughter to protect. A life we built here. And now," he choked on the words. "Son, listen to me," Earl pleaded. "Those documents prove you were right. The reactor was I don't care about being right. Jack slammed his fist against the counter. I cared about keeping my daughter safe, giving her a normal life. Now there are reporters calling me a traitor outside my home. The silence stretched between them, heavy with betrayal. I'll fix this, Earl said finally. I promise. You've done enough. Jack hung up. Throughout the day, Jack watched through his windows as reporters interviewed locals. He saw old Ben shake his head and walk away. Miss Clara shooed them from her bait shop with a broom, but others talked, and with each conversation, Jack felt his carefully built world crumbling. The television news was worse. Disgraced former Navy commander attempts to rewrite history. One headline blazed. They showed old footage of his court-martial, his younger self being stripped of rank, photos of the Roosevelt. Interviews with former crew members who called him reckless, dangerous. None of them knew the truth. How the reactor's cooling system had been failing. How his superior had ordered them to continue the test anyway, risking a meltdown that would have poisoned the entire eastern seaboard. How Jack had chosen insubordination over catastrophe. As evening approached, the rain began first a gentle patter, then a steady drumbeat against the windows. Jack's phone buzzed again. A text from Tommy, the dockmaster. Come quick, Grace. Jack grabbed his raincoat and ran through the downpour to the harbor. The reporters had finally gone, driven away by the weather. But what he found at his slip stopped him cold. Grace, his beloved boat, their weekend triumph, turned to ash. Someone had slashed her hull with what must have been a knife or box cutter, leaving long, jagged wounds in her freshly painted sides. And there, in dripping red paint across her bow, one word: traitor. Jack's knees gave out. He knelt on the wet dock beside Grace, rain mixing with tears he couldn't hold back. All the work, community's help, all the pride they'd felt at the regatta destroyed in an act of hate. The rain fell harder, washing streaks of red paint down Grace's wounded hull like blood. Jack stayed there, kneeling, as the storm soaked through his clothes. Each drop felt like judgment, like the weight of secrets finally breaking free. Behind him, footsteps approached on the dock. He didn't need to turn to know it was Earl. The old captain stood silently in the rain, witnessing the destruction his well-meaning intervention had wrought. The wind carried the faint sound of Earl's voice. Oh my God. Jack? But Jack didn't respond. He just knelt there beside Grace as the rain fell, watching red paint bleed into the dark harbor waters below. The morning after, the vandalism dawned gray and heavy with unshed rain. Earl's weathered pickup truck crawled down the narrow street to Jack's house, its tires crunching on loose gravel. The news vans had finally dispersed, leaving only torn paper cups and cigarette butts in their wake. Earl's hands trembled slightly as he reached Jack's front door. Before he could knock, he noticed fresh scratches in the wood where reporters had taped their business cards. Taking a deep breath, he rapped 3 times. "Jack?" he called softly. "It's Earl. Please, just give me 5 minutes." Inside, Jack sat at his kitchen table, staring at a cold cup of coffee. He heard Earl's voice but didn't move. Ellie watched from the hallway, her small face pinched with worry. "Daddy, maybe we should—" "No, sweetheart." Jack cut her off gently. "Not today." Earl knocked again, more insistent this time. "Jack, I know I messed up. I never meant for any of this to happen." Jack's jaw tightened. He could picture Earl outside, probably wearing that old Navy cap he always had on, looking like a guilty dog waiting to be let in from the rain. But the betrayal cut too deep. After a few more minutes, Earl's footsteps retreated down the porch steps. Through the window, Jack watched him climb back into his truck and drive away. At the local market later that morning, whispers followed Jack through the aisles. Mrs. Peterson, who'd always bought his fish, turned away when she saw him coming. But old Ben from the hardware store made a point of shaking his hand, saying loudly, "Good morning, Commander." with deliberate respect in his voice. The town was choosing sides. Some, like Ben, stood firmly with Jack. They'd known him for years. Watched him raise Ellie alone. Seen his quiet dignity. Others muttered about smoke and fire, wondering what else he might be hiding. Back at the harbor, Jack stood before Grace. The cruel word traitor still marred her hull, though he'd tried scrubbing it away for hours. His eyes traced the familiar curves of her bow, remembering all the peaceful mornings they'd shared. Now she looked as wounded as he felt. Mr. Stevens made an offer, he told Ellie, who'd followed him to the dock. He'd take Grace off our hands. Give us enough to start fresh somewhere else. No, Ellie's voice cracked. This is our home. Grace is our home. Her eyes filled with tears. Why can't you just talk to Grandpa Earl? He was trying to help. Help? Jack's voice came out harsher than he intended. He dug up things that were buried for a reason, honey. Some things need to stay in the past. Mom would want you to forgive him, Ellie said quietly. Jack felt the words like a physical blow. He knelt down to her level, his throat tight. Because sometimes forgiveness feels like surrender, he whispered. And I've surrendered enough already. Ellie ran off toward home, leaving Jack alone with his thoughts and the lapping waves. At the harbor cafe, Earl sat in his usual corner booth, pushing a plate of untouched eggs around with his fork. Miss Clara watched him from behind the counter, her kind face creased with concern. Finally, she brought him a fresh cup of coffee and slid into the seat across from him. You look like you're carrying the weight of the whole bay on your shoulders, she said gently. Earl's shoulders slumped. I wanted to help him, Clara. Everything I found, the testimonies, the letters, they proved Jack was a hero. He saved that submarine and her crew. But now, he gestured helplessly at the window, where Grace's damaged hull was visible in the distance. The road to trouble is paved with good intentions, Clara said, but her voice was kind. Earl straightened up, something fierce and determined crossing his weathered face. I won't give up until Jack's name is cleared. Even if he never speaks to me again. He pulled out a thick folder of documents. The truth's all here, plain as day. Someone just needs to listen. As evening approached, storm clouds gathered over the bay. Jack stood at his bedroom window, watching the first lightning flashes illuminate the dark water. Each burst of light showed him Grace, still faithfully moored at her pier despite her wounds. The sight of her made his chest ache. The Vandal's paint had cut deeper than her hull. It had reached into the past, dragging up memories he'd fought so hard to bury, the klaxons blaring on the Roosevelt, the captain's illegal order, the choice that had saved lives but cost him everything. He'd learned to live with the weight of it all, found peace in his simple life with Ellie and Grace. Now that peace was shattered, and he wasn't sure he had the strength to rebuild it again. Another flash of lightning split the sky. In its brief illumination, Grace's silhouette stood proud against the gathering storm. Despite everything, she remained steady at her moorings, refusing to break, just like she always had, just like he always had. The rain began to fall, drumming against the roof as Jack watched the darkness gather over the bay. In the distance, Grace rocked gently against her lines, her damaged hull a darker shadow in the gloom. She looked lonely out there, he thought, wounded but unbroken, waiting for tomorrow's tide. The late morning sun struggled through thick clouds as Earl shuffled through his mail at his kitchen table. Bills, advertisements, and a plain white envelope with no return address. His arthritic fingers fumbled with the seal before extracting a single sheet of cream-colored paper, official Navy letterhead visible at the top. Earl's coffee grew cold as he read, his eyes widening with each line. The signature at the bottom made his hands shake. Admiral Richard Cole, recently retired from the Pentagon's naval operations. Earl had served under him briefly in '82. My God, he whispered, reaching for his reading glasses to study the documents more carefully. The letter was clear and damning. Commander Tanner's superior officer, Captain James Rourke deliberately falsified maintenance reports on the USS Roosevelt's reactor cooling systems. When Commander Tanner discovered critical safety violations during the weapons test, his refusal to proceed wasn't insubordination. It was the only action that could have prevented catastrophic failure. Earl's throat tightened as he read the enclosed copies of the original mission orders. The margins were filled with handwritten notes detailing systematic negligence, all in Captain Rourke's distinctive scrawl. The dates matched perfectly with Jack's court-martial. "That lying bastard," Earl muttered, his coffee completely forgotten. He spread the papers across his kitchen table, arranging them chronologically. The story they told was clear. Jack had discovered dangerous reactor maintenance shortcuts just hours before a scheduled weapons test. When he'd refused to proceed, Rourke had ordered him relieved of command and forced the test forward anyway. Only Jack's quick thinking and direct intervention had prevented a meltdown that would have killed everyone aboard and contaminated miles of coastline. Instead of being celebrated as a hero, he'd been silenced and dishonorably discharged to protect Rourke's career. Earl's hands clenched into fists. He'd seen similar cover-ups during his own service good men sacrifice to protect the powerful. But this time, he had proof. The morning stretched into afternoon as Earl made calls to his old Navy contacts. Many doors that had been closed suddenly opened at the mention of Admiral Cole's name. By evening, Earl had compiled a thick folder of supporting evidence: maintenance logs, crew statements, and reactor specifications that all corroborated the Admiral's letter. "This is it," Earl said to himself, carefully organizing everything into a presentation folder. "This is what we needed." The Navy Board of Inquiry was scheduled to meet in Washington, D.C. next week. Earl knew the protocols he'd testified before them twice during his own career. His hands moved automatically as he typed up his formal request to appear. Muscle memory from decades of military paperwork taking over. As sunset painted his kitchen walls orange, Earl's phone rang. It was his old friend, Captain Davidson from the Judge Advocate General's office. "They'll hear your testimony, Earl," Davidson said without preamble. "Tuesday at 09:00. But you better be damn sure about this. These kinds of allegations against a senior officer, they'll tear you apart if you can't back them up." "I've got the proof right here in front of me," Earl replied, patting the folder. "And I've got Admiral Cole's letter." "Cole?" Davidson's voice sharpened. "That changes things. He's still respected, even in retirement. This could actually work." After hanging up, Earl sat in his darkening kitchen, staring at the folder. The magnitude of what he was about to do settled over him like a heavy blanket. He was going to challenge the Navy's official story, accuse a decorated captain of negligence and fraud, and try to restore the reputation of a man who barely spoke to him anymore. Damn the consequences, Earl muttered, standing up. He grabbed his keys and the folder, heading for his truck. The drive to Jack's small house took only minutes, but Earl's heart pounded with every turn. Most of the windows were dark, but he could see a faint light in what he knew was the kitchen. Jack was still awake. Earl parked and walked slowly to the front door, his shoes crunching on the gravel drive. The porch light stayed dark. Jack never turned it on anymore, not since the reporters started coming around. He knocked firmly. No response. "Jack?" Earl called softly, not wanting to wake Ellie. "I know you're in there. I need to talk to you." Silence stretched out, broken only by the distant sound of waves against the shore. But Earl could sense movement inside a shadow passing behind the door, the faint creak of floorboards. "I've got proof, Jack. Real proof. About what happened on the Roosevelt. Admiral Cole sent me everything. The falsified reports, the original orders, all of it." Earl's voice grew stronger. "Rourke was wrong. You were right, and I can prove it now." The shadow behind the door didn't move, but Earl knew Jack was listening. "I'm testifying before the board next Tuesday in D.C. They're going to hear the truth. Finally. All of it." Earl placed his hand on the door, speaking directly to the wood grain. "You're a good man, Jack. You saved those sailors' lives. You did the right thing. and I'm going to make sure everyone knows it." Still no response, but Earl could almost feel Jack's presence on the other side, could picture him standing there in the darkness, struggling with years of buried pain and anger. "I know you're mad at me," Earl continued, his voice softening. "I know you think I should have left it alone. But sometimes a friend has to fight for you, even when you won't fight for yourself." He stepped back from the door, straightening his shoulders. "I'm going to clear your name. Whether you like it or not, you deserve that. Ellie deserves that. And those men whose lives you saved, they deserve to know the truth too." The Find Pressination door remained firmly closed. But somewhere inside, Earl heard what might have been a muffled sob. Or maybe it was just the wind. Either way, he'd said what he came to say. He turned and walked back to his truck, the folder of evidence tucked securely under his arm. Behind him, Jack's house stayed dark and silent, but Earl smiled slightly as he drove away. The truth would finally come out, whether Jack was ready for it or not. The floorboards creaked softly under Jack's feet as he made his way down the narrow hallway of their small house. Dawn was just beginning to paint the sky in gentle strokes of pink and gold. He'd barely slept, tossing and turning all night, Earl's words echoing in his mind. As he approached Ellie's room, he noticed her door was slightly ajar. The sight that greeted him made him pause in the doorway, his heart catching in his throat. Ellie knelt by her window, her small hands clasped together, head bowed in the soft morning light. Her whispered words carried clearly in the quiet house. "And please help Daddy and Grandpa Earl be friends again. Amen." Jack's chest tightened. She hadn't noticed him yet, and he watched as she opened her eyes and gazed out at the harbor where Grace's familiar silhouette bobbed gently in the distance. "Good morning, sweetheart," he said softly. Ellie turned, not startled, but wearing an expression far too serious for her young face. "Morning, Daddy. I was just talking to God about the boats." "The boats?" Jack moved into the room and sat on the edge of her bed. "Mm-hmm." Ellie climbed up next to him, her small feet dangling. "Grandpa Earl says God fixes broken ships if you just keep sailing." She looked up at him with her mother's eyes. "He told me that when we were painting Grace." He said sometimes the best boats are the ones that got fixed after being broken. Jack felt the weight of her words settle over him. Earl had become such a presence in their lives these past weeks, teaching Ellie knots, telling her stories about the sea, bringing her ice cream after school. The old captain had filled a grandfather-shaped hole in his daughter's life that Jack hadn't even realized was there. "Do you miss him, honey?" Jack asked, though he already knew the answer. Ellie nodded, picking at a loose thread on her pajama sleeve. "He tells the best stories, and he makes you smile sometimes, Daddy. Real smiles." She paused, then added with childhood wisdom, "He's sorry he made you mad. He told me so." Jack's throat felt tight. He'd been so caught up in his anger, in feeling betrayed, that he'd forgotten how much Earl's presence had meant to both of them. The old captain had brought color back into their lives, like fresh paint on Grace's weathered hull. "Daddy?" Ellie's voice was small. "Are we going to leave? Because of the mean words on Grace?" Jack pulled her close, remembering how she'd cried when she'd seen the vandalism on their boat. "No, sweetheart, we're not running away." The words came out, stronger than he expected, and he realized he meant them. He thought about Earl, probably sitting alone at his usual spot in the cafe, still fighting for Jack's honor when Jack himself had given up. The old man's stubborn loyalty, even in the face of Jack's anger, spoke of something deeper than mere guilt or obligation. "Actually," Jack said, looking down at his daughter, "I think it's time we went on a little trip." Ellie's eyes widened. "Where?" "To Washington, D.C. To help Grandpa Earl tell some important people the truth about the submarine." Jack nodded, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. About the submarine, about everything. The smile that broke across Ellie's face was like sunshine after a storm. She threw her arms around his neck. "Can we go see him now? Please?" Jack glanced at the clock. Barely 6 a.m. But he knew Earl would be at the cafe already, nursing his morning coffee and planning his testimony. "Get dressed," he told her. "Quick as you can." 20 minutes later, they walked hand in hand down the quiet harbor street. The morning air was crisp, with the promise of autumn, and seabirds wheeled overhead, their cries echoing across the water. As they approached the cafe, Jack saw Earl through the window, sitting alone at his usual corner table, papers spread out before him. Jack squeezed Ellie's hand, then pushed open the door. The bell chimed softly. Earl looked up, surprise flickering across his weathered face. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Ellie broke free and ran to Earl, who opened his arms automatically to catch her in a hug. "Easy there, Admiral," Earl said, his voice rough with emotion. Over Ellie's head, he met Jack's eyes, uncertainty clear in his expression. Jack walked to the table, his steps measured. The morning sun streamed through the window, catching the silver in Earl's hair, highlighting the deep lines of worry in his face. This proud old sailor who had swallowed his own pride to help a man he'd once mocked, a man who had become family. "Heard you're heading to Washington," Jack said quietly. Earl nodded, his hand still resting protectively on Ellie's shoulder. "That's the plan." "Need some company?" The words hung in the air between them. Earl's eyes widened slightly, then filled with understanding. He stood slowly, extending his hand across the table. "Welcome aboard, Commander." Jack took the offered hand, feeling the strength in the old captain's grip. The sun crested fully over the harbor, flooding the cafe with golden light. "Let's finish this voyage together," Jack said, and meant it with all his heart. The marble steps of the naval headquarters gleamed under the harsh winter sunlight as Jack and Earl made their way up to the entrance. Jack's breath came out in small white puffs in the cold December air. His dress uniform, pulled from the back of his closet after years of disuse, felt stiff and foreign against his skin. "You ready for this?" Earl asked, his own metals catching the light. Jack nodded silently, his jaw tight. The security checkpoint felt like passing through a portal to his past life. Their footsteps echoed off the polished floors as they followed a young ensign through the maze of corridors. The hearing room doors loomed before them, heavy oak panels that seemed to hold the weight of judgment behind them. Jack's hand trembled slightly as he straightened his tie one last time. Inside, the room stretched out like a cathedral to military order. 3 long tables formed a U-shape at the front, where 7 senior officers sat in their dress blues, their faces carved from stone. Rows of wooden chairs filled the rest of the space, occupied by various officers and officials. Jack recognized a few faces from his submarine days. Some looked away. Others offered slight nods of acknowledgement. Admiral Richard Cole sat at the center of the panel, his silver hair and weathered face reflecting decades of service. His eyes met Jack's with an now unreadable expression. "This hearing is now in session," Admiral Cole announced, his voice filling the hushed room. "We are here to review new evidence regarding the USS Roosevelt incident and the subsequent court-martial of Commander Jack Tanner." Jack and Earl took their seats at the small table facing the panel. The leather chair creaked under Jack as he sat, his back straight as a mast. The familiar scent of polished brass and starched uniforms brought back a flood of memories. Earl stood first when called to testify. His usual boisterous manner was replaced by a dignified gravity that commanded attention. He pulled out a worn leather folder and began laying out letters on the table before him. "Distinguished members of the board," Earl's voice rang clear and strong. "I present to you letters from crew members of the USS Roosevelt, men who served under Commander Tanner during the incident in question." He lifted the first letter. "This is from Chief Petty Officer James Martinez, Reactor Division." Earl's voice grew passionate as he read. Commander Tanner's decision that day wasn't just about disobeying an order. It was about choosing between blind obedience and preventing a nuclear catastrophe. He knew the reactor readings were critical, despite what command was telling us. His actions saved not just our boat, but potentially the entire eastern seaboard. One by one, Earl presented more letters. Each told a similar story, of a commander who chose conscience over career, of a leader who protected his men at the cost of his own future. Jack sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed forward, but his hands clasped tightly in his lap. These men, Earl continued, his voice thick with emotion, some of whom risked their own careers to write these letters, all tell the same truth. The order Commander Tanner disobeyed would have resulted in disaster. The subsequent cover-up destroyed a good man's career to protect those who were truly at fault. The Admiral and his subsequent panel listened intently, occasionally conferring in whispers. When Earl finished, a heavy silence filled the room. "Commander Tanner," Admiral Cole said finally, "would you like to address this board?" Jack stood slowly, his chair scraping against the floor in the quiet room. He looked at the faces before him, men who held his future in their hands once again. But this time was different. This time he wasn't standing alone. "Sir," he began, his voice low but steady, "for years I've lived with the consequences of that day. I've watched my daughter grow up in the shadow of my disgrace. I've sailed a fishing boat instead of a submarine." He paused, drawing a deep breath. "But if I had to make that choice again, to follow orders that would have killed my crew or to save those men, I would make the same decision every time." His voice grew stronger as he continued. "The cost was my rank, my career, my reputation. But those men lived. They went home to their families. They had children. Built lives." Jack's eyes met Admiral Cole's directly. "If saving men cost me my rank, I'd pay it again." The silence that followed felt like the pressure at crushed depth. Admiral Cole studied Jack for a long moment before speaking. "This board will need time to deliberate on the evidence presented today," he announced. "We will reconvene tomorrow morning at 0900 hours with our decision." The gavel's sharp crack echoed through the room. Jack and Earl gathered their papers slowly as the room emptied. Neither spoke until they were outside in the gathering darkness. The cold air bit at their faces as they stood on the steps of the building that had just heard Jack's truth after all these years. The city lights were starting to twinkle in the early evening gloom, and traffic hummed in the distance. They stood there, two naval officers, one disgraced, one retired, waiting for a verdict that could change everything or nothing at all. The morning sun filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor of the Naval Headquarters waiting room. Jack Tanner sat rigidly in his chair, his weathered hands clasped tightly in his lap. Next to him, Earl fidgeted with his tie, both men dressed in their best suits, though Jack's was slightly worn at the elbows. A young petty officer appeared at the door. "Commander Tanner, Captain Denton, the board will see you now." Jack stood slowly, smoothing his jacket. Earl gave him an encouraging nod as they followed the officer back into the hearing room. The space felt different today, somehow both smaller and more imposing. Morning light streamed through tall windows, illuminating the faces of the gathered officers. Admiral Richard Cole sat at the center of the long oak table, his expression unreadable. Commander Lewis Briggs, who had been so confrontational during yesterday's testimony, now sat quietly to one side, his eyes downcast. The room smelled of coffee and polish and tradition. "Please be seated," Admiral Cole said, his voice carrying clearly across the room. Jack and Earl took their places at the simple table, facing the board. Jack could feel his heart pounding against his ribs, but he kept his face carefully composed. He'd learned long ago that a commander never shows fear, even when facing his own judgment. The Admiral picked up a document, adjusting his reading glasses. The rustle of paper seemed impossibly loud in the hushed room. Jack noticed Earl's hand gripping the edge of their table, knuckles white with tension. "Commander Jack Tanner," Admiral Cole began formally. "This board has reviewed all evidence presented regarding the USS Roosevelt incident, including recently declassified documents, crew testimonials, and expert analysis of the vessel's technical data from that day. He paused, removing his glasses and looking directly at Jack. We have also taken into careful consideration the testimony provided yesterday by Captain Earl Denton and was yourself. Jack sat perfectly still, the way he used to on silent running drills, when even a whisper could give away position. The morning light caught the brass buttons on the Admiral's uniform, sending little flashes across the room. It is the finding of this board, Admiral Cole continued, his voice taking on a warmer tone, that your actions aboard the USS Roosevelt were not only justified, but demonstrated the highest traditions of naval leadership and moral courage. Jack felt something catch in his throat. Beside him, Earl let out a small, choked sound. The evidence clearly shows that you faced an impossible choice. Follow orders that would have led to catastrophic failure of the reactor systems, or disobey those orders to save your crew and vessel. The Admiral's voice grew stronger. You chose to protect your men and prevent what could have been a nuclear disaster. That decision cost you your career, your reputation, and years of your life. The Admiral stood, and the entire room rose with him. Commander Tanner, this board hereby fully exonerates you of all charges. Your nuclear submarine commander certificate is reinstated, effective immediately. Your service record will reflect the truth of your actions, and a commendation for extraordinary courage will be added to your file. Jack blinked rapidly, feeling moisture gathering in his eyes. He struggled to maintain his composure as Admiral Cole stepped around the table, drawing himself to attention. "Welcome home, Commander," the Admiral said softly, raising his hand in a crisp salute. Jack returned the salute, his arm steady even as a tear finally escaped down his cheek. The room remained silent, but he could feel the weight of history lifting from his shoulders with each passing second. Earl was beaming beside him, no longer bothering to hide his own emotions. Several of the board members were nodding in approval, and even Commander Briggs had risen to offer a respectful salute. After the formal, Mander Briggs at a present and raid my 9, into now use of the term, whether dismissal. Jack and Earl made their way through the marble halls toward the building's entrance. Their footsteps echoed off the walls, past the portraits of stern-faced admirals and the battle flags of centuries of naval history. The morning air outside felt fresh and clean, like the first breath after surfacing from a deep dive. They stopped at the top of the steps, looking out over the city. The American flag snapped crisply in the breeze above them. Earl turned to Jack, clasping his shoulder firmly. His eyes were bright with pride and satisfaction. "Told you, the sea remembers the truth," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. Jack looked at his friend, thinking of Grace bobbing in her harbor slip back home, of Ellie's prayers by the window, of all the years of quiet dignity and hidden pain. He thought of second chances and the way the tide always returns. "Maybe it also forgives," he replied softly. The harbor buzzed with excitement on a perfect autumn morning. Chesapeake Bay's waters sparkled like scattered diamonds under the bright sun, as townspeople gathered around Jack Tanner's restored fishing boat, Grace. American flags fluttered from every corner of the vessel, and rows of white folding chairs lined the dock. Miss Clara from the bait shop had spent hours decorating the pier with red, white, and blue bunting. Old Ben, wearing his pressed marine dress uniform, helped direct people to their seats. The whole town seemed to have turned out fishermen in clean shirts, shopkeepers who'd closed early, and families with children who'd been let out of school for the occasion. Jack stood at Grace's helm, tugging uncomfortably at the collar of his newly pressed navy dress uniform. The brass buttons gleamed in the sunlight, and his commander's stripes looked stark and fresh against the dark fabric. After years of wearing worn fishing clothes, the uniform felt strange, like putting on someone else's skin. Earl Denton appeared at his side, also in full dress. Uniform, his chest heavy with medals. "Stop fidgeting, son," he said quietly. "You've earned this moment." Ellie sat nearby in a pretty blue dress, swinging her legs and beaming with pride. She'd helped polish every brass fitting on Grace until the boat sparkled like new. "Daddy looks like the pictures again," she whispered to Earl, who squeezed her shoulder gently. A group of Navy officers in formal whites made their way down the dock, led by Admiral Richardson from the Board of Inquiry. The crowd fell silent as they approached. Jack straightened his spine, muscle memory from years of service taking over. "Commander Tanner," the Admiral began, his voice carrying across the water, "we gather today not just to reinstate your rank and honors, but to right a wrong." He gestured to an aide who stepped forward with a polished wooden case. "Your nuclear submarine commander certificate. Fully reinstated." The Admiral opened the case, revealing the gold-embossed document, along with your micarted, body ope embossed, medals for distinguished service in the Navy Cross, which should never have left your possession. Jack's hands trembled slightly as he accepted the case. He could feel the weight of every eye on him, but it was Ellie's gaze that steadied him. Her mother's eyes, looking back at him with pure joy. The Admiral stepped back, and Earl moved to the center of Grace's deck. He cleared his throat, looking out over the gathered crowd. "When I first saw Jack Tanner," Earl began, his voice rough with emotion, "I made the worst kind of mistake. I judged a man by the rust on his boat instead of the strength of his character." He paused, glancing at Jack. "But sometimes God gives us second chances to see the truth." Earl's voice grew stronger as he continued. "I've served with hundreds of sailors in my career, but I've never known a finer officer or a better man than Jack Tanner. He chose to sacrifice everything to save his crew, then bore that sacrifice in silence for years, asking nothing, expecting nothing." Tears glistened in Earl's eyes. That's what real honor looks like, folks. Not in the shine of medals or the cut of a uniform, but in the quiet courage of a man who does what's right, no matter the cost. Jack stepped forward then, the wooden case clutched in his hands. The microphone squealed slightly as he adjusted it, and he had to clear his throat twice before speaking. "These honors," he said softly, "they don't belong just to me." He looked down at Ellie, who smiled encouragingly. "They belong to my late wife, Sarah, who never lost faith in me, even when I lost faith in myself." His voice cracked slightly. "And they belong to my daughter, Ellie, who taught me that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is just keep sailing, even when the storm seems too strong." He turned to Earl. "And they belong to a friend who reminded me that truth, like the tide, always finds its way home." The crowd burst into applause, and several fishermen let out piercing whistles. Miss Clara wiped tears from her eyes with her apron, and old Ben stood at rigid attention, offering a perfect salute. As the formal ceremony concluded, people began mingling on the dock and deck. Congratulations flowed freely, along with Miss Clara's famous lemonade and cookies. The atmosphere felt like a hometown festival, with children running between adults' legs and old stories being shared with new enthusiasm. Jack found a quiet moment to lean against Grace's railing, watching the scene with wonderment. Earl joined him, 2 paper cups of lemonade in hand. "Quite a difference from that first day at the cafe," Earl said, passing him a cup. Jack nodded, smiling. "Grace has come a long way since being called a bathtub." "We all have, son. We all have." The late afternoon sun had begun its descent toward the horizon, painting the bay in sheets of gold. The water glittered like liquid amber, and a gentle breeze carried the salt-sweet scent of the sea. Ellie appeared suddenly, between them, wrapping her arms around Jack's waist. "I'm so proud of you, Daddy," she said, squeezing tight. The crowd, sensing a moment, broke into fresh applause. Jack held his daughter close, feeling the weight of his reinstated medals, the warmth of the setting sun, and the love of his community wrap around them like a protective embrace. The tide sparkled with sunset gold, and Grace rocked gently beneath their feet, as if the old boat too was joining in the celebration of truth, finally finding its way home. The morning sun painted the Chesapeake Bay harbor in shades of amber and gold, its gentle rays dancing across the rippling water like scattered coins. A warm breeze carried the mingled scents of fresh paint, sawdust, and salt air across the weathered docks, where a large canvas banner fluttered proudly between two tall wooden poles. Project Grace, restoring lives, one hull at a time. The bold blue letters caught the light, casting soft shadows that swayed with each gust of wind. Jack Tanner stood at the edge of the main pier, his calloused hands tucked deep into the pockets of his worn denim jacket, watching the bustling scene before him with quiet pride that filled his chest like a warm tide. 6 months had transformed the once sleepy harbor into a vibrant workshop of hope and renewal, where the sounds of hammering, sanding, and cheerful conversation created a symphony of purposeful work. Dozens of veterans, their faces bearing the weathered lines of service and sacrifice, worked alongside eager local volunteers, breathing new life into old boats that many had written off as beyond saving. The air itself seemed different now, charged with possibility and determination. Where once there had been only the lonely cry of seagulls and the gentle lapping of waves against empty docks, now there was the steady rhythm of restoration. The harbor had awakened from its slumber, transformed into something Jack had never dared to imagine during those dark months, when shame had been his only companion. "Mr. Tanner," called out Tommy, a 12-year-old boy with unruly brown hair and a paint-splattered t-shirt that bore more colors than a rainbow. His sneakers squelched against the wet dock as he bounded over, his face bright with enthusiasm. "Can you help us with this sanding? We're not sure if we're doing it right. And Mrs. Peterson said you'd know exactly what to do." Jack's weathered face creased into a genuine smile, the kind that reached his eyes and chased away the shadows that had lived there for so long. He walked over with measured steps to where Tommy and 2 other neighborhood kids were hunched over an old skiff, their small hands gripping sandpaper blocks with the fierce concentration only children could muster. The boat's hull showed patches of fresh work alongside areas still scarred by years of neglect. "Remember what we learned about going with the grain?" Jack asked gently, kneeling beside them on the dock. He demonstrated with slow, deliberate movements, his experienced hand gliding smoothly along the weathered wood. "The boat tells you which way it wants to be touched, just like people tell you how they want to be treated. You've got to listen with your hands, feel what the wood is saying." The children nodded solemnly, their young faces serious with the weight of this wisdom. They adjusted their technique, following Jack's example with the careful attention of students eager to please a beloved teacher. Nearby, Earl Denton's booming laugh echoed across the water like a foghorn announcing good news, carrying clear and strong to every corner of the harbor. His white hair caught the morning light like spun silver as he gestured enthusiastically with paint-stained hands, sharing stories and hard-earned wisdom in equal measure to a group of veterans replacing waterlogged planks on a weather-beaten fishing boat. The men worked with the focused intensity of those who had found purpose again, their movements synchronized like a well-drilled unit. "Now that's craftsmanship," Earl called out, his voice rich with approval as he patted the shoulder of a young veteran who had just finished fitting a perfect joint. The man's face flushed with pride at the recognition, his hands still trembling slightly from old wounds that ran deeper than flesh. "You've got the touch, son. These old boats know when someone cares about doing things right. They can feel it in every nail and every brushstroke." The veteran, barely 25, but carrying eyes that had seen too much, straightened his shoulders at Earl's words. Jack had watched this transformation dozens of times over the past months. Broken spirits finding their way back to wholeness through the simple act of creating something beautiful with their hands. Ellie weaved between the workstations like a butterfly dancing through a garden, her honey-colored ponytail bouncing with each enthusiastic step. She carried supplies in a canvas bag slung across her shoulder and offered encouragement to everyone she passed, her voice bright as morning sunshine. She had grown taller in the past months, her gangly 12-year-old frame shooting up like a young sapling reaching for light, but her heart remained just as expansive and generous as ever. Jack watched with wonder as she helped a younger girl carefully paint registration numbers on a dinghy's bow, both of them giggling like conspirators as drops of paint occasionally found their way onto fingers and cheeks instead of wood. "Your daughter's a natural leader," said Miss Clara, appearing beside Jack with the quiet grace of someone who had spent decades moving through the world with purposeful kindness. She handed him one of 2 steaming cups of coffee, the ceramic warm against his palm and the rich aroma rising like incense in the morning air. Her silver hair was pulled back in its customary bun, and her eyes crinkled with the warmth of someone who had seen enough of life to recognize a miracle when it unfolded before her. Just like her daddy. Jack accepted the coffee with a grateful nod, wrapping his fingers around the cup and feeling the heat seep into his perpetually cold hands. "She's got her mother's spirit," he said softly, his voice carrying the gentle reverence he always used when speaking of Sarah. Always seeing the best in people, always ready to help. Sometimes I think she inherited every good thing about both of us and left all the broken pieces with me. "Miss?" Clara smiled knowingly, her gaze following Ellie as the girl helped an elderly veteran steady a paint can. "Maybe that's how grace works," she said. "It skips the broken parts and lands where it's needed most." Throughout the morning, the harbor hummed with activity that felt almost musical in its rhythm and purpose. Veterans who had once felt lost and adrift found new meaning in the steady work of restoration, their hands rediscovering skills they thought they'd forgotten. Some arrived each day with haunted eyes and trembling hands, remnants of battles fought in distant places, but found unexpected peace in the rhythmic motions of sanding and painting. The repetitive work became a form of meditation, a way to quiet minds that had been too long at war with themselves. Others, who had struggled to connect with family and friends after their service, forged new friendships over shared tasks and quiet understanding. They spoke in the shorthand of those who had seen the same shadows, offering comfort without words and support without judgment. Jack had watched former strangers become brothers, their bond forged not in combat, but in the gentle work of bringing beauty back to forgotten things. Near noon, when the sun had climbed high enough to chase away the morning chill, Jack climbed aboard Grace with the familiar confidence of a man returning home. The boat that had once drawn mockery and whispers now gleamed with fresh paint and polished brass fittings that caught the light like stars. Every plank had been lovingly restored, every joint sealed with care, every detail attended to with the precision of craftsmen who took pride in their work. He ran his weathered hand along her railings, the smooth wood warm beneath his palm, remembering with crystal clarity the day 6 months ago when Earl had first proposed the ambitious idea of Project Grace. "Every broken boat is just waiting for someone to believe in it again," Earl had said, his voice carrying the conviction of a man who had discovered truth. "Just like every broken spirit. Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to see past the damage to the beauty underneath." The program had started small and humble, just 3 boats and a handful of volunteers who weren't entirely sure what they were doing. But word spread quickly through veteran networks and local communities like ripples expanding across still water. Soon, donations of tools and materials poured in from unexpected places. Retired craftsmen offered their expertise freely, eager to pass on skills learned over lifetimes of work. Local families brought homemade food for the workers, creating impromptu picnics on the docks. The harbor transformed into something more than just a workplace. It became a sanctuary where healing happened one careful brushstroke at a time. Jack moved slowly to Grace's stern, where a small brass plaque now hung like a beacon of memory and hope. "In memory of Sarah Tanner, who taught us grace never fails." The metal had been polished to a warm glow, and someone, probably Ellie, had placed a small bouquet of wildflowers beneath it. He touched the plaque gently with reverent fingers, thinking of his late wife and how her face would have lit up seeing this place now, seeing the way broken people had found each other and created something beautiful together. Earl climbed aboard with heavy but sure footsteps, his weight familiar on the newly reinforced deck. The boat barely rocked, under his substantial frame a testament to the quality of their restoration work. "Quite a sight, isn't it?" he said, joining Jack at the polished railing and gazing out over the bustling harbor with satisfaction written across his weathered features. "Never thought I'd see the day when my big mouth actually led to something good instead of just causing trouble." Jack chuckled, the sound low and warm. You just needed the right target for all that hot air. Sometimes the loudest voices are the ones calling out for something worth believing in. Speaking of hot air, Earl grinned, his eyes twinkling with the mischief that had never quite left him despite his years. Got word from the VA yesterday. They want to expand Project Grace to 3 more harbors along the coast. Seems we're not the only ones who needed this kind of healing. They're talking about funding, official recognition, the whole 9 yards. Jack felt his chest tighten with emotion he couldn't quite name. The idea that their small experiment in grace could spread, could touch other lives in other places, seemed almost too wonderful to believe. Below them on the dock, Ellie's clear voice rang out as she organized a group of younger children painting bright, whimsical fish designs on a rowboat's freshly sanded hull. Her confidence had bloomed alongside the program like a flower, finding perfect soil, her natural ability to comfort and encourage others shining through in everything she did. She moved among the children with the easy authority of someone born to lead, offering gentle corrections and enthusiastic praise in equal measure. Remember, Daddy says every brushstroke is like a prayer, she told her young crew, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone far beyond her 12 years. We're not just fixing boats. We're helping hearts heal. So we have to paint with love, not just with our hands. Jack felt his throat tighten at her words, overwhelmed by the depth of understanding she carried and the way she had absorbed the lessons of grace without ever being formally taught them. How far they'd all come from those dark days of shame and isolation, when each morning had felt like a battle just to face the world. The journey from disgrace to grace hadn't been easy or quick, but each small step had led them here, to this moment of purpose and peace that felt as solid as the restored deck beneath their feet. Standing at Grace's bow, Jack watched the afternoon sun paint the harbor in fresh light that seemed to bless everything it touched. The water sparkled like diamonds scattered across blue silk, and the gentle waves lapped against hulls with the rhythm of a contented heart. Behind him, the sounds of work and laughter rose with the changing tide, a symphony of healing and hope that filled the air with music more beautiful than any he had ever heard. Some storms wreck us to rebuild us, he whispered to the warming air, his words carried away on the breeze like a prayer released to find its own way home. From the dock below, Ellie's voice floated up clear and true as a church bell, calling the faithful. Daddy says the sea forgets nothing. But sometimes, when we do the hard work of making things right again, it forgives. What would you do if you were in their place? Comment your answer below, and let's see how you'd rewrite the ending. If you enjoyed the story of Jack Tanner, I handpicked the next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.